Moving into our new home was supposed to be the beginning of a dream for my family and me. After months of searching, Sarah, the kids, my dad George, and I finally found a house that felt just right. It was in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, tucked away from the noise of the city, but close enough to schools, parks, and a grocery store to make life easy. The house itself was everything we wanted: spacious, with room for the kids to run around, plenty of light pouring through the windows, and a cozy yard out back where George could sit and enjoy the sunshine. But, as is often the case, perfection comes with its quirks. For us, it was the steps. 3 steps up to the front door may not seem like much to most people, but for George, who's been in a wheelchair for the past several years, they were an insurmountable barrier. Every time I looked at those steps, I thought about how they contradicted everything else we loved about the place. A house that should have felt like a fresh start for George now seemed like a daily reminder of obstacles we'd worked so hard to overcome. The neighborhood itself was postcard perfect. Well-maintained lawns, kids playing on cul-de-sacs, and friendly neighbors who waved as we unloaded the moving truck. It was managed by a homeowners association, or HOA, as I would quickly learn to both dread and loathe. At the helm of this HOA was Karen, who introduced herself on our second day. At first glance, she seemed like the quintessential suburban leader, impeccably dressed, armed with a bright smile, and eager to welcome us. But there was something in the way she spoke, a practiced politeness that felt rehearsed, as though she had a mental checklist of acceptable things to say, but no genuine warmth behind them. Karen didn't hide her curiosity when she noticed George in his wheelchair. She greeted him briefly, but quickly redirected her attention to me and Sarah, as if avoiding any real engagement with him. I brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to awkwardness. But, in hindsight, it was the first sign of the pattern to come, a pattern of exclusion, control, and subtle hostility. For the first few days, life seemed to settle into a routine. The kids loved exploring the house and yard. Sarah started unpacking and organizing, and I busied myself with little projects here and there. But every time George needed to get in or out of the house, those steps became an ordeal. We'd have to help lift his wheelchair, which was awkward and exhausting for everyone involved. George tried to laugh it off, joking about needing a personal crane, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. It was obvious what we needed: a ramp, something simple, temporary, and removable that would give George the independence to come and go as he pleased. It seemed like such a minor adjustment, hardly worth a second thought. Little did I know that ramp would soon become the centerpiece of an all-out battle between us and Karen's HOA, one that would test our patience, our unity as a family, and even our faith in the kindness of a community. As soon as the last box was unpacked and the furniture found its place, Sarah and I turned our attention to solving the most pressing issue: the steps at the front of the house. They were a daily reminder that George's independence was limited, and every time we had to lift his wheelchair, I couldn't help but feel like we were failing him. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating for him and physically draining for us. We needed a ramp, and we needed it fast. The solution seemed simple enough. After a bit of research, we found a temporary ramp that could be installed without drilling or permanently altering the house. It was a clean, sturdy design that blended well with the look of the home. Sarah and I even measured everything down to the inch to make sure it wouldn't block pathways or stand out awkwardly. It was functional, unobtrusive, and most importantly, it would give George the freedom he deserved. Since the neighborhood was governed by an HOA, we knew we couldn't just put the ramp in place without approval. So we did what we thought was the responsible thing. We filled out the required request forms, included all the details, and submitted them to Karen for review. We even attached pictures of the proposed ramp to show how seamless and temporary it would be. Confident in the practicality of our plan, we assumed it would be a quick approval process. Weeks passed without a word. At first, we chalked it up to the bureaucracy of the HOA. Surely these things take time. But as the silence dragged on, I began to wonder if our request had even been reviewed. I called the HOA office twice and emailed Karen directly, each time receiving vague, non-committal responses like, "It's under consideration," or "We'll get back to you soon." Frustration began to mount. Finally, the answer came in the form of a curt letter. "Your request to install a ramp has been denied," it read. The reasoning? The proposed ramp does not align with neighborhood standards and would detract from the aesthetic consistency of the area. My jaw dropped. How could a ramp, something so vital for George, be considered an eyesore? Determined to resolve the issue, I arranged to speak with Karen directly. She welcomed me with her signature polished smile, the one that masked an impenetrable wall of indifference. When I pointed out that the ramp was temporary, easily removable, and would not damage the property, she cut me off mid-sentence. "I understand your concerns, Mike," she said in a tone that made it clear she didn't. "But rules are rules. We can't make exceptions, no matter the circumstances." Her refusal wasn't just frustrating, it was dehumanizing. It wasn't about aesthetics or standards. It was about power, about enforcing control at the expense of compassion. I left the meeting with a bitter taste in my mouth. After weeks of dead-end conversations with Karen and a mounting sense of helplessness, Sarah and I made a decision. Enough was enough. George needed that ramp, and we weren't going to let bureaucratic nonsense stand in the way of his independence. One Saturday morning, with a toolbox in hand and determination in my heart, I set to work assembling and installing the ramp. The process was surprisingly straightforward. The ramp was exactly as advertised: secure, lightweight, and easily removable. It fit perfectly over the front steps without obstructing the pathway or altering the house's exterior. By the time I was finished, I stood back and admired the result. It was functional, subtle, and a far cry from the neighborhood-destroying eyesore Karen had implied. Most importantly, when George saw it, his face lit up. For the first time since we'd moved in, he could come and go without us hovering over him. For one day, everything felt right. Then Karen showed up. The next morning, as I was cleaning up the yard, I spotted her marching toward our house with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. Her expression, an unsettling mix of fury and triumph, told me this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. "Good morning, Karen," I greeted her, trying to maintain some semblance of calm. She didn't return the pleasantry. "Mike," she snapped, pointing dramatically at the ramp. "This is unacceptable. You violated HOA regulations by installing this without approval." I took a breath and explained as calmly as I could that the ramp was temporary, removable, and caused no harm to the property. I even reminded her that our initial request had been denied on arbitrary grounds, leaving us with no other option. Karen, however, wasn't interested in logic. "Rules exist for a reason," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If we start allowing exceptions like this, where does it end? You'll need to remove it immediately." I stood my ground. "Karen, this isn't about bending rules. It's about my father being able to live his life with dignity. The ramp stays." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might physically block the ramp herself. Instead, she delivered her ultimatum. "If you don't comply, the HOA will take formal action. Expect fines, and possibly more." As she stormed off, clipboard in hand, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disbelief. The ramp wasn't some frivolous addition, it was a basic necessity. Yet Karen was treating it like a personal affront, a challenge to her authority that she couldn't let slide. A few days later, the promised formal action arrived in the form of an HOA letter. The language was cold and legalistic, but the message was clear: remove the ramp within 7 days or face escalating fines and potential legal consequences. The letter made no acknowledgement of our situation or George's needs. It was just another attempt to bully us into submission. As I read the letter aloud to Sarah, she shook her head in disbelief. "They can't get away with this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. I nodded, already knowing what we had to do. Karen might have been hoping her threats would scare us into compliance, but she had underestimated one thing: we weren't giving up without a fight. Removing the ramp wasn't an option, not for George, not for our family. We needed help. That evening, we called an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Over the next few days, we worked closely with her, digging through the HOA bylaws and regulations. To our surprise, there was no explicit prohibition against temporary structures like our ramp, especially when they addressed accessibility needs. Karen had no solid ground to stand on. Her argument about neighborhood harmony was little more than a thinly veiled excuse to assert her authority. Armed with this knowledge, we began to plan our next move. Karen, meanwhile, was ramping up her campaign. She called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she dramatically referred to as the ramp issue. Flyers were distributed to all the neighbors, painted with Karen's narrative that the ramp was a slippery slope. Pun apparently intended, that threatened the neighborhood's aesthetic and would encourage further unauthorized modifications. It was absurd, but her influence over the HOA board was undeniable. In response, Sarah and I organized a small gathering at our home. We invited our neighbors to hear our side of the story. It wasn't easy. Karen had already sown seeds of division, and some were hesitant to even show up, wary of appearing to defy her. Still, a few brave souls came, curious and open-minded. I shared George's story, starting with his service as a decorated veteran who had spent his life working hard for his family. I explained how the ramp wasn't a luxury or a statement, it was a lifeline. Sarah chimed in, emphasizing how temporary and unobtrusive the structure was, showing photos and explaining its functionality. George, ever humble, simply thanked the attendees for their time, his quiet dignity speaking volumes. The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors expressed heartfelt support, nodding along, and even offering to speak on our behalf at the upcoming HOA meeting. Others, though sympathetic, were reluctant to go against Karen, fearing retaliation. "She's been running this place for years," one whispered. "She doesn't forget, and she doesn't forgive." The HOA meeting itself was tense. Karen stood at the front, projecting authority as she laid out her case against the ramp. She spoke of preserving the community's image and maintaining consistency, throwing in thinly veiled remarks about setting dangerous precedents. It was all cloaked in the language of regulation, but the underlying message was clear. She didn't care about George or his needs. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, nerves buzzing, but resolve strong. I started by addressing the room, not Karen. "This isn't about a ramp," I said. "It's about dignity. It's about my father being able to live in his home without feeling like a burden. We're not asking for something unreasonable. We're asking for compassion and understanding." I detailed how the ramp met all safety standards and was fully removable, causing no permanent changes to the property. I even cited sections of the HOA bylaws that supported our case. As I spoke, I noticed shifters in the audience. Neighbors who had once seemed unsure were now nodding along. Karen interrupted, her tone sharp. "We can't make exceptions, Mike. If we allow this, what's next? Garish lawn ornaments? Painted fences?" Her words hung in the air, absurd and petty. I didn't flinch. "What's next, Karen? Maybe a neighborhood where we support each other instead of tearing each other down. That's the kind of community I want to live in." The room fell silent. I could feel the tide beginning to turn. For the first time, Karen looked less sure of herself. She still had her supporters, but the narrative she'd constructed was unraveling, thread by thread. Whether or not we'd win wasn't clear yet, but for the first time, I felt like we had a real shot. After weeks of preparation with our attorney, Sarah and I found ourselves standing in front of the city council. It was intimidating, to say the least. The room was packed, not just with council members, but with a handful of neighbors, curious onlookers, and of course, Karen, who sat with an air of self-assured indignation. Her clipboard was perched on her lap like a shield, and her eyes flicked to me with thinly veiled disdain. Our attorney began by outlining our case, citing the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and its clear provisions to protect accessibility rights. She emphasized that the ramp was temporary, met all safety requirements, and caused no harm to the property or neighborhood. "This isn't a matter of aesthetics," she concluded. "It's a matter of ensuring a resident's basic rights to access his home." Then it was my turn. I felt a knot of nerves tighten in my stomach as I stepped forward, but I focused on George, on his resilience, his quiet pride, and the injustice of what he'd been put through. "This ramp isn't about breaking rules or defying the HOA," I said, my voice steady. "It's about dignity. It's about ensuring my father can live his life with the independence he's earned." I detailed how we had exhausted all proper channels, only to be met with arbitrary decisions and a refusal to consider our family's needs. "We've done everything by the book," I said. "The ramp is temporary, removable, and respectful of the neighborhood's appearance. The only disruption it causes is to the life of someone who has done nothing to deserve this treatment." Karen was next, and as she rose to speak, her tone was sharp and accusatory. She argued that the ramp threatened the visual harmony of the neighborhood and set a dangerous precedent. Her words felt hollow, lacking the substance or empathy to sway anyone who wasn't already firmly in her corner. The more she spoke, the more evident it became that this wasn't about rules. It was about control. The council members listened patiently, their expressions neutral but attentive. When Karen finally finished, they asked a few clarifying questions, mostly about the ADA and the ramp's compliance with local safety codes. Our attorney answered confidently, pointing out that the ramp was well within legal bounds and that Karen's objections were rooted in personal preference, not law. The deliberation felt like an eternity, but when the council finally returned, their decision was clear. After reviewing the details of this case, one member announced, "We find no grounds to support the HOA's objection to the temporary ramp. It is in compliance with safety and accessibility standards, and federal law protects the family's right to make such accommodations." A wave of relief washed over me. Karen's expression froze, her usual smugness replaced with visible frustration. She started to protest, but the council member cut her off. The HOA's role is to serve the community, not to impose undue burdens. This decision is final. As Sarah squeezed my hand, I looked at George, who sat quietly in the audience. He nodded at me, a small but meaningful gesture of gratitude. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we could finally breathe again. The ramp would stay, and with it, a sense of justice that Karen couldn't take away. The aftermath of the council's decision was almost as satisfying as the victory itself. Karen's iron grip on the HOA began to unravel, her veneer of control cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. It didn't take long for neighbors to start speaking up, sharing stories of how she had wielded her position like a personal weapon. Tales of arbitrary fines, unwarranted warnings, and petty disputes surfaced, and the once intimidating figure of Karen suddenly seemed far less imposing. At the next HOA meeting, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Where Karen once commanded the room with a mix of authority and fear, she now stood isolated, her usual allies silent or absent altogether. The residents had had enough. When the vote to remove her as president was called, it passed overwhelmingly. Her replacement, Julia, was a breath of fresh air, a warm, approachable neighbor who promised to rebuild trust and put the community's needs first. In the days that followed, Sarah and I noticed a change in how people interacted with us. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before now stopped by to chat. Some even apologized, admitting they had stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. A few offered to help with yard work or bring over meals as a gesture of goodwill. It was humbling and heartening at the same time. George, ever the quiet observer, smiled as he watched the neighborhood slowly transform. "Sometimes it takes a fight to remind people what matters," he said. And he was right. The ramp wasn't just a victory for our family. It was a reminder to everyone that fairness and kindness can prevail when we stand together. Looking back on everything, I've come to realize that this fight was about far more than a ramp. It was about standing up for my family, for my father's dignity, and for the principles of fairness and decency. At times, the odds felt insurmountable, facing a system so tangled in bureaucracy and led by someone as stubborn and self-serving as Karen. But through it all, I learned an invaluable lesson. Sometimes you have to push back against the system, even when it feels daunting, because justice is worth fighting for. What struck me the most was the power of community. At first, I thought we were standing alone, but as the conflict unfolded, neighbors began to rally around us. Their support wasn't just a boost for our case, it was a reminder that people are capable of incredible compassion when they are given the opportunity to see the humanity behind an issue. By coming together, we were able to shine a light on the injustice and demand change. Not just for our family, but for the neighborhood as a whole. Now, life in our home feels peaceful in a way it hadn't before. George uses the ramp with pride, a small but meaningful victory that symbolizes so much more than access. It represents resilience, equality, and the importance of never giving up. Sarah and I have found a deeper appreciation for the home we fought so hard to make ours, and our kids have learned the value of standing up for what's right. This experience showed me that while systems like HOAs can feel rigid and unyielding, they're not infallible. When enough voices unite against injustice, even the toughest barriers can come down. And as I watch George roll out the front door, smiling and free, I know this battle was worth every step.